In this video I'm going to tell you how to paint anything, really anything, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, it has to be clickbait, you can't paint anything, right? Wrong, you can. This way of thinking reminds me of my 5-year-old son. He doesn't believe that he can draw something if he's never done it before. Like, you need to have some experience painting crocodiles to paint one crocodile. This logic implies that you would need specific training for every single subject before you can paint it. It's ludicrous. If it was the case, we could never paint anything at all because we would simply have no time to ingest so many methods and training hours for every single object in the world that can be painted. The thing is, visually speaking, it doesn't matter that a crocodile is a crocodile. It matters that it has a certain combinations of ovals and rectangles, a certain distribution of lights and shadows. And when you stop thinking about objects as things and only treat things as 2D models, it starts to make sense that one can indeed paint anything. It all starts with choosing your subject. Let's start with a good model. Good model, good painting. This entire thing is about painting anything from a reference, so don't waste your time trying to figure it out on your own unless you've painted it 1,000 times before. If it's the first time you're trying to paint an object, just get a good model. Don't try to make it out on your own. Select objects that interest you and have a variety of textures, colors, and shapes. If it's a hand you want to paint, take a photo with your phone. If it's a flower, go out in your garden and pick one. You might need to purchase some props to make it look more convincing, if you have the budget for it. And if not, then just use Google Image and gather as many references as possible. Make sure you have the rights to copy a photo though. But what if what you want to paint is more complex or imaginary? Like a giant metallic machine with a red glowing core? Well, look at what I did. I improvised a little maquette of sorts with a garbage can and a few objects collected in my studio, simply to get convincing lights to paint what I had in mind. We'll see later that what matters the most is the light, not the details. That's why even a very simple arrangement of props can work as a good model. Arrange them in a composition that has a clear focal point, good balance, and interesting interplay of light and shadow. And lighting is key. Above everything else, use consistent lighting. Natural light from a single direction is often the best. You can also use a lamp to create strong shadows and highlights, but all the various objects you want to use in the same composition need to be placed under the same light source. To facilitate the setup and lighting, you can use a still life black box, which would be ideal. Secure your objects and arrange your workspace so that you can work comfortably next to your easel. A real-life model will always be more helpful than a photo, but if you have to work from a photo, try to place your model right next to your canvas as close as possible so that you can easily and comfortably refer to your model during your painting session. Alright, really quick break. If you're interested in learning more about oil painting techniques or color mixing techniques, you can check out my courses. The links are in the description below. You'll find everything you need there. Chapter number 2, how to draw anything. Drawing anything accurately starts with understanding shapes and structure. It's not the place here to learn how to draw anything, but know that if you can draw anything, you're halfway there to paint anything. Break down the subject into basic geometric shapes like circles, squares, triangles, rectangles, and ovals. Sketch the basic shapes lightly on your paper. These shapes will serve as the foundation of your drawing. Pay attention to the proportion of these shapes relative to each other, and begin connecting the shapes to then form a cohesive structure. Think about how the shapes interact and overlap, and more importantly, focus on the shapes of the shadows and specifically the edge separating the light side from the dark side. This is your main line. This part is drawing, but from line to light, because it's already about lights and shadows and values. Determine the light source in your scene and observe where the light hits your subject and where the shadows fall. This will help you add depth and realism when time comes to paint. Shade the parts that are away from the light source and add highlights where the light is the strongest. By breaking down any subject into simple shapes and understanding the structure of the light distribution, you can build a strong foundation for accurate and realistic drawings and easily finish with paint. Practicing drawing will help you switch from 3D mode to 2D mode, and indeed when drawing and painting, you need to convert a three-dimensional model into a flat picture that still represents the volume but on a flat surface as an illusion of form. The third point is tonal underpainting. Painting realistically involves a keen understanding of how light interacts with objects and how to translate that interaction into accurate lights, midtones, and darks. So first you want to carefully observe the model and pay close attention to how light falls on it, where the shadows are, and how the values change with different lighting. At first you want to focus on values only. If it helps, you can paint the first layer in black and white. It's a technique called grisaille. I have multiple videos about it. If you're interested, you can check them out. Start by establishing the basic values, highlights, midtones, and shadows. If it helps, you can paint the first layer in black and white. It's a technique called grisaille, and I have multiple videos about that on my channel. You can check them out. Start by establishing the basic values, highlight, midtones, and shadows. Block in the darkest areas first, then the lightest areas, and finally the midtones. This provides a value map for your painting, and this value map follows the proportion of the drawing which was part of the previous stage. If you're not working in grisaille, you want to block in the colors gradually. You want to identify the lightest areas where the light hits directly, then use lighter colors and mix them with white to get the correct value. Apply these colors lightly, blending the edges softly at first into the surrounding areas. Find the midtone areas that transition between the light and the darks and really pay close attention to this area because it's the key area. You want to mix colors that are between highlights and shadows, blending them smoothly to avoid harsh lines and edges. For the darkest areas where the light is completely occluded, use darker colors, possibly mixed with complementary, to deepen the shadows and apply them sparingly to create depth and play with reflected lights. Chapter 4. To paint anything, you need a good color mixing strategy. Painting anything means mixing any color for any object. Let's start with a good all-round palette that I strongly recommend, or maybe not a palette, but a selection of pigments that should allow you to mix as many colors as possible. So here it is: titanium white PW6, yellow ochre PY42, burnt sienna PR101 or PBR7, Venetian red or English red PR101, permanent alizarin crimson PV19 or PR177 or quinacridone rose PV19, cadmium red PR108 or pyrrole red PR254, cobalt teal blue PG50, French ultramarine blue PB29, phthalo green yellow shade PG36, raw umber PBR7, burnt umber PBR7, and finally ivory black PBK9. To mix any color from a model accurately, start by identifying the local color you're trying to replicate, i.e. the most representative color unaffected by highlights and shadows. The secret of color mixing, if we can say that it's a secret, is the following. You can't find the right color. You have to start with a base and compare methodically to get closer to the model gradually. Color cannot be simply found. You have to try, compare, and adjust. Try, compare, and adjust. It's impossible to start with nothing. You have to make a mixing base to start with, then take the time to compare it to the model, and ask yourself what needs to be changed so that the mix gets closer to the model. You should ask yourself 3 questions in a specific order. What is the difference in hue? What is the difference in value? And what is the difference in chroma or saturation? And continuously compare your mixed color to the model under consistent lighting conditions, making incremental adjustments to match the hue, value, and chroma precisely. This method ensures a more controlled, more accurate color mixing process. Pre-mixing can also be a really good idea to make colors look more realistic. It implies preparing a scale of at least 3 values of a given color to paint the highlights, midtones, and shadows in a structured way. Pre-mixing is a practical approach that can help you save time in the long run and paint more methodically. If you're just in the beginning and struggle with mixing, I strongly recommend this method. Chapter 5, you need a good blending strategy. Once your colors are accurate and your main values are in place, start blending them and work on polishing the form. Blend the transitions between the lights and the midtones and the darks smoothly to create a realistic gradation. The realism will come from the successful blending. Use soft brushes for blending and adjust the pressure to control how much you blend. Observe and add subtle reflected lights in the shadow areas. This light usually comes from the environment and affects the color and values of the shadows. Try to make a habit of stepping back and viewing your painting from a distance. Make adjustments to the values and details to ensure accuracy and cohesion. Ensure that there are no harsh lines unless intentionally created for effects. Revisit the darkest areas and deepen them if necessary. Use a small amount of black mixed with other dark colors to avoid to create something too flat. Add the brightest highlights last. If you can avoid pure white, use a very light tint of the highlight color and apply these sparingly to the highlight areas where the light is the most intense. Number 6, texture and details. The success of a painting lies in your ability to reproduce the textures realistically. It's not just about getting the right color. The texture and appearance of the object will also affect its color. Everything lies in the reflective properties of the surfaces. The color depends on the way the surface reflects the light. Matte surfaces reflect diffusely, which means that the light is reflected in all directions and the color is the same in all directions of observation. With a matte surface, the color has less variations and has a more even appearance, a more flat appearance. Glossy surfaces, on the other hand, produce a specular reflection, which means that they reflect light in one direction only, and they act basically like mirrors, and they have reflections on their surfaces. For example, you can see the shape of a window or the shape of the light source on the surface. The glossier the surface, the sharper the reflected image will be. A glossy appearance gives way more depth to the color, but the local color is also more difficult to find because many surrounding objects are reflected on the surface of the object, while a matte appearance will provide duller colors overall, but a local color that's clearly identifiable and easy to see. The more matte an object is, the closer the color of the highlights to the local color. Indeed, highlights are caused by the reflection of the light source. So if the surface is very matte, then the lightest color of the object is its local color and highlights are almost non-existent. On the other hand, the glossier a surface is, the more clearly the reflections are visible with sharp edges and high contrast. The highlights are a direct reflection of the light source, so they force you to really think about the orientation of the light source, the shape of the object, and the angle of incidence. But if you can paint these successfully, the texture will immediately appear, creating a wonderful impression of volume and realism. It was said that in ancient Greece, the painter Zeuxis was so good at representing textures that birds would fly down to peck at the grapes that he painted. I don't know how true this story is, but Pliny the Elder states that Zeuxis and another painter named Parrhasius once had a painting contest, and Zeuxis deceived the birds with the realism of his grapes and felt pretty good about himself. But when the time came to remove the curtain hiding Parrhasius' painting, it turned out that it wasn't even a curtain but a painted illusion. It's a funny story, I don't know how true it is, but regardless, it shows how important textures are in creating realistic looking paintings. If you try to improve at painting textures, use different brushes and techniques to mimic the texture of the object. For example, stippling for rough surfaces, smooth blending for a glass, and impasto for thick texture-heavy areas. Pay attention to the way the light interacts with the surface of each object. Use fine details and brushstrokes to suggest texture without explicitly painting every detail. For example, just a few small highlights well placed can suggest the sheen of a metal surface with no effort. Finally, remember to use focus differently depending on what you paint. Add the most detail to the focal point of your composition and leave the rest more loose and not detailed, so that the focus naturally draws the viewer's eye to the most important part of the painting. Gradually reduce the amount of detail as you move away from the focal point. This creates a sense of depth and directs attention. Use sharp, crisp edges for areas in focus and softer edges for background elements or less important areas. This helps create a sense of depth and focus. Add the brightest highlights and the deepest shadows last. Use pure white very sparingly for highlights to maintain realism. And by following these steps and paying close attention to texture, colors, and details, you can create a realistic and compelling painting. Alright, so that's it. That's all I have for this video, my friends. If you want to see another one, just click here and I'll see you for the next one. As always, joy and inspiration to you. Bye.